Tudor Travel Guide here, and welcome to today's episode of the Tudor Travel Guide's A to Z of Tudor Places. And today we're going to be visiting a place that you might not have even heard of. That's Cawood Castle in North Yorkshire. It's certainly well off the tourist trail, however it is a key location in Tudor history, being associated with two notable events, the first involving Thomas Wolsey and the latter with Catherine Howard. Now, if you're heading up north on your Tudor road trip, particularly if you plan to visit the gorgeous and historic York, which is one of the finest ancient cities in the country, then you might want to consider a trip out to today's location, and you might even want to stay there, for it is one Tudor location in which you can actually book accommodation. Now, more about that at the end of the video. Well, let's get on with the history, shall we? Why is Cawood Castle on the Tudor map? Well, as I hinted at, it was the place in which Cardinal Thomas Wolsey retreated after falling from favour in 1530. And then 11 years later, the palace was visited by Henry VIII himself, with Catherine Howard at his side during their momentous progress to the north. The palace lying just 7 miles from the great city of York, where Henry was due to meet his nephew, the Scottish King James V. Well, that didn't quite go to plan, but never mind. Now, today, Cawood Castle is but a shadow of the once great archiepiscopal palace that at the height of its glory days was described as the veritable Windsor of the North. Windsor, of course, having this great Norman castle which was of immense strategic importance to the medieval kings of England. So it was being compared with that. Now, sited close to a major city, i.e. York, and on the navigable banks of the River Ouse, Cawood's foundation can be traced back to the year 930, when the Saxon king, Athelstan, granted land at Cawood to the diocese of the aforementioned city. Subsequently, the fortunes of the manor house, which was also called a castle, waxed and waned, first as a simple residence of the Archbishop, and then as an almost impregnable fortress, with the property being built up at various times before falling into decay, and that's a cycle which seems to have repeated itself through Cawood's illustrious history. So, what of the village of Cawood and its palace? What do we know of how both appeared in or to the 16th century traveller? Well, John Leyland, that famous antiquary and cartographer who we've met before, in his famous itinerary provides a short but contemporary account of the surroundings of Cawood Castle, stating that, quote, "After another 4 miles, where the soil was good and the pasture and corn and woodland, I crossed the river and arrived at Cawood. The Archbishop has a very fine castle here." And we also have another snippet of information about how the castle looked in its heyday from a book by Blood and Taylor called Cawood, an archiepiscopal, such a difficult word to say, landscape. And in it we hear that the palace was clearly meant to be approached from the south corner of the village marketplace across the Bishop's Dyke, which was presumably by a bridge, alongside an assumed continuation of the gatehouse range, then left through the gatehouse, more on the gatehouse in a moment, and into the palace proper. So we'll hear much more about this range later. So it is in fact this gatehouse and its range which are the only substantial remains of the palace today, and unfortunately we don't have any floor plans or contemporary drawings of the palace which survive from the medieval period, nor do we have any detailed descriptions of the palace buildings themselves. Thus, Frustratingly, we simply do not know exactly how Cawood appeared to the likes of Wolsey, Henry VIII or Catherine Howard. But all is not lost, my time-travelling friends, because from the surviving buildings and an 18th century etching and a number of key documents, including one particular account by George Cavendish, who was Wolsey's gentleman usher, who was at Cawood with Wolsey, we can build up a reasonable picture of the palatial residence that witnessed these electrifying events nearly 500 years ago. Now, Alistair Oswald, who's a landscape archaeologist at the University of York, has done a lot of work on Cawood, and he states that in Henry VIII's time, the palace was almost certainly comprised of two square brick or back-to-back courtyards. And of course, that dual courtyard arrangement was typical of a fashionable, high-status house of the day. And when we know that, we can begin to predict with a degree of certainty how the chambers of the palace were arranged. Now, as I said, the main surviving range today was originally the gatehouse range, although confusingly, today it's actually called the banqueting house. Anyway, this marked, as I said before, the entry into the palace complex. The front range of the outer court probably provided stabling and accommodation, i.e. in this gatehouse range. And the real dining hall, the real banqueting hall, would have occupied the range between the two courts. A chapel would have stood on one side of the court, and the Archbishop's private accommodation would have occupied the rear side of the inner court, or perhaps the eastern side, which had fine views out over the garden. One of the reasons we know so much about Cawood is that in 1465 there was an enormous party there, and it was called the Great Feast of Cawood. It was, in fact, one of the greatest medieval feasts ever recorded, and it was staged to celebrate the enthronement of George Neville, brother of the Kingmaker, as Archbishop of York. Happily for us, the lists of guests, the food served, and the seating arrangements survive, and in these documents we hear of some of the other chambers: the Great Hall, the Chief Chamber, the Second Chamber, the Low Hall, and the Gallery. Must have been an enormous event. And then we have two other inventories which were compiled towards the end of the castle's life, and they help us further reimagine its original appearance. And we hear of rooms like the hall, the pantry, the buttery and the ewry. And we also hear of specific chambers like my lord's sleeping chamber, the chapel, the little gallery towards the waterside, the library and the chamber in the tower. And that name's but a few. In fact, there were 49 chambers or apartments listed in all at Cawood. Okay, big significant place. But it was Thomas Wolsey who, of course, was arrested at Cawood in 1530, and then, of course, 10 years later, we have Catherine and Henry arriving on the northern progress of 1541. That was to be Catherine's last summer on earth, and therefore, because of that, it's incredibly important to Tudor history. Not long after, of course, Catherine returns to London and she's arrested on failure to disclose her earlier sexual relations and adulterous affair with Thomas Culpeper, which had been going on throughout the entire summer progress to York. Anyway, after Wolsey's fall, the Archbishops of York largely abandoned Cawood and they moved towards York to Bishopthorpe, where they established their main base. And in fact, the castle at Cawood was essentially, well, its fate was essentially sealed at the end of the Civil War, when it had been caught up in fighting between the Royalists and the parliamentarian forces. And after the conclusion of the war, on the 30th of April 1646, Parliament sadly resolved that Cawood would be made unusable, and so the old castle was reduced to a ruin, and only the gatehouse and its adjacent range survived the onslaught of the demolition. Of course, Cawood today is no longer strategically important. The bustling medieval village, which was once frequented by kings and queens and princes and archbishops, now rests quietly amidst relatively flat, open pasture land. But you can clearly see the ruins of the castle from public land. Apart from its importance to Tudor history, the other reason that I have included Cawood in this A to Z is that you can book to stay in the gatehouse. The gatehouse, the surviving buildings, are owned by the Landmark Trust, and I've been lucky enough to see inside and see the views from the rooftop, which you can enjoy, and they are spectacular. And it must be very special indeed to stay there, knowing that every day the likes of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII, Thomas Wolsey, and actually even Edward I and a young Richard III all pass, and probably more, all passed underneath the gateway where you are staying. Mind you, take heed, this is a popular destination and it's often fully booked well in advance. So if you do want to stay there, you'd be well advised to plan at least a year ahead, particularly if you intend to stay during the busy summer months. Now, you can find out more about Cawood and contact the Landmark Trust through their website, which is www.thelandmarktrust.org.uk. And finally, we come on to my Tudor Rose rating for Cawood Castle. Now, this is my own personal perspective based on a number of different factors. The first being historical significance, for which I would give Cawood 5 stars. The arrest of Wolsey is well documented and a wonderful event in Tudor history, and for that it earns its 5-star rating. The wow factor, 3. Lovely to behold, but because it is only a fragment of the original palace, I can't mark it any higher than that. The authenticity, well, what you see is what you get. It's raw and real, so I give it 4. However, for the accessibility, I would only give it 1 star. You can't actually get up to the ruins unless you are staying in the gatehouse range, although they are clearly visible from the roadside and therefore you can see them during reasonable daylight hours. And for that, as I say, I give it 1 Tudor Rose. Do remember, if you've enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel. There will be many more A to Zs coming over future months. And of course, if you want to stay in contact with me, keep in touch with all the latest events, development, blogs, podcasts, etc. Make sure that you also subscribe to my newsletter via the homepage of my website, which is www.thetudortravelguide.com. Again, links are in the description below. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you on our next A to Z of Tudor Places adventure. Happy time travelling!